Should we get started? So, for the next 2 hours, we're going to talk about brain inflammation. And I don't have a lot of slides on this topic, and that's because what I want to do is focus on the diagrams that I have. If you understand the diagrams, you'll understand everything. So we're going to focus on the diagrams. And believe it or not, even though our topic is brain inflammation, which can also be called neuroinflammation, I almost forgot that I just published an article on this topic last month. And this is it. So I published this letter in a journal called Nature Reviews Rheumatology. Probably one of the top, in my opinion, one of the top 3 journals in rheumatology. And every once in a while, what I like to do is test my ideas. And I have 2 or 3 ways of testing my ideas. One is to teach, like students, because they're always critical and they're always looking for something to complain about. So if I teach to students, then somebody will complain about something, and that's a way for me to test my ideas. The other way is giving presentations like this, because usually somebody will say they disagree or something like that, and we can try to figure out what's right and what's wrong. And the other way that I test my ideas is I publish them in big journals like this every once in a while. So the advantage to publishing in big journals like this one is it's a way, like I said before, it's a way to test my ideas and see if I can get them past a certain level of critique. But the problem with publishing in journals like this is that they usually don't provide much space. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Noam Chomsky in the United States. Maybe most of you. Noam Chomsky is a linguist, and he talks about argument and like the structure of arguments. Well, one of the ways to win an argument is to simply limit the amount of time that you give your opponent. And that definitely occurs in science, because we all, like, the big journals always put limits, right? You only have so much space, you can only use so many citations. So that's one of the ways that they're able to win their arguments. And most big journals are friendly towards drug companies. So they tend to want to support and publish big articles from drug companies. And maybe some of you know why that is. It's because if they publish an article that's friendly to the drug companies, then the drug companies will buy reprints of the article and distribute those to doctors. So it's a way that the journal makes money is by publishing articles that they know they can sell to the drug companies, right? Well, because that's why they don't want to publish on nutrition, because nutrition companies won't do the same thing. Nutrition companies won't buy an article and send it to doctors. But the drug companies do it all the time. So part of what I do is when I see something that I don't like, I sometimes try to write a rebuttal to it, like I did with this article. And the reason that that's relevant for today's conversation is that, as I'm sure many of you know, what we see in science these days is contamination of that science and twisting of science so that it promotes a certain model of disease, which, of course, then sells more drugs and keeps people dependent. And I think diabetes is a great example of that. I think the cause and cure of diabetes is very straightforward. but people have to remain, the population has to be confused, right? Otherwise, they would cure their own problems and they wouldn't be dependent on drug companies. This is our after lunch chat. But another really great example of the exploitation of science is in fibromyalgia. It's perfect. Fibromyalgia, in my opinion, has been completely hijacked by the drug companies. And this article represents some of that conversation. So what I find with fibromyalgia is that by far, perhaps 100%, of the review articles are written by people who work for drug companies. And what would you expect their conclusion to be? Their conclusion of fibromyalgia is that it has no identifiable cause, that these patients have what's called central sensitization, which means that they have altered perception of pain signals within their brain, which causes them to be extra sensitive to pain. And because fibromyalgia has no cause that's been identified, and because these patients have this central sensitization problem within their brain, therefore, these patients must be on drugs for the rest of their life, right? That's the conclusion that they want to arrive at. And that's the conclusion to which they arrive. So I'm just giving you a little bit of background. I think fibromyalgia has been completely hijacked by the drug companies. And to give you an example of that, other than what I already mentioned, which is most of the articles are sponsored by drug companies, is that this article that I wrote, and this is not even a month old. I just published this last March 3rd is when this came out. So it's less than a month old. Part of the reason, the main reason that I wrote this article was because I think the other author was kind of misusing science, I would say, to promote ultimately the sales of drugs. However, I'm just going to share with you something that happened kind of behind the scenes. So my suspicion was that this author was misusing science, and that's still my conclusion. I mean, that is my opinion, and I'm not changing my idea on that. But the question that arose for me was, why would this guy do that? Because, for example, he says he has no conflict of interest. And I said, well, maybe this is this guy's opinion, and maybe his opinion is just different from mine. But that doesn't make it wrong, of course. Even though I think he's wrong, maybe he's not. So I did some background research on the author of this original study and found out that he was paid by like maybe 4, 5, 6 different drug companies, and that he works for a medical school that just received $1 million from one of the drug companies, right? So I found that to be a pretty strong conflict of interest that was not reported. Perhaps it wasn't reported to the journal, but then I reported it to the journal and they still didn't publish it. So then they're obviously involved in keeping that quiet as well. So anyway, that's my introduction to fibromyalgia, and now we'll get into some of the details. But like I said, I had almost forgotten that I published this, even though it was just last month. But this is basically what we're talking about today. And just to go back and connect a few ideas, this is also part of the reason why I started publishing books about 10 years ago, is because to write an article in most journals, they always put space limitations. You only have the equivalent of about 5 or 6 pages at the most, and you can only use maybe whatever, so many citations, depending on the journal. And that's why I published my big books, is because I need more space to build my argument and talk about treatment approaches as well. What Noam Chomsky says, I referred to him just a moment ago, what he says is that the way the system wins, the way the system wins the argument, is they limit the rebuttals, and they frame the conversation. And they repeat the same thing over and over again. So anybody who wants to come along and say something new is seen as completely radical, right? So let's get radical. That's the situation. So we're going to talk about brain inflammation. This comes from chapter 5 of the book. I think maybe I don't know if everybody's had a chance to see it. Maybe we can pass it around if you want. Like I said, I've got 3 copies of the new book. I've got 1 copy of last year's version. It's on Amazon.com. If you want to get it on Amazon, it's $250 US. On my website, it's $170, and I've got a couple of copies here that I just want to not carry around, so we'll let those go at a discount. But anyway, I've published this a couple of times. I've published it recently in a book called Brain Inflammation. But again, it's from chapter 5 of the big book here. So let's talk about how to approach this topic. So I just made this up the other day. This might be new. I don't know if you have this in your notes. But these questions are: what is it? When does it happen? And why does it keep happening? Assuming that it's real, how does it continue? And then how do we treat it? So I think those are reasonable questions. First question is it real? The answer, of course, is yes, it's very real. So what I call brain inflammation, because it's easy to understand, is also called neuroinflammation, as you just saw in my article. We see this in patients who have brain injury, any type of illness or infection or vaccination or immune response. So let's talk about that. So one of the things that I want everybody to understand is that every time you're working with a patient who has like systemic inflammation, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, but also diabetes, anytime you're working with a patient who has any type of inflammation, they're also experiencing brain inflammation. So people can have brain inflammation without systemic inflammation, but anybody who has systemic inflammation also has brain inflammation. And that also happens when people are sick. That's why you see change in behavior when people are sick. It's called sickness behavior. And so what is sickness behavior? Fatigue, depression, change in sleep, and usually either eating more or eating less. So change in sleep and change in eating behavior. People also, when they're sick, tend to become unsocial, so they want to be alone. They typically have no interest in fun activities or sexual pursuits. But definitely fatigue, depression, maybe a little bit of an anxiety. So that's called sickness behavior, and it's a reflection of brain inflammation. And the other thing that I want to mention, so I've already said that people who have systemic inflammation have brain inflammation. The same thing is true when people have any type of infection. They have systemic inflammation, it changes brain behavior, it changes brain function. We call that sickness behavior. But another point that I want to make, based on at least 2 studies that have been published, very basic studies, is that when people get vaccinated, they also have brain inflammation. Now, for some people, they get vaccinated and they just feel sick for a few days, and then they're fine afterwards. But I'm sure you've heard of people who get vaccinated and they develop an acute or chronic encephalitis. Their brain is inflamed for weeks, months, or years, right? Everybody's heard of that? Well, I think what we're talking about right now actually helps to explain that phenomenon. So, for example, you all heard of the controversy connecting vaccinations with autism, right? I think that that association is very difficult to understand unless we understand brain inflammation. So we'll talk about that more. It's actually not a major point, but it's an important point. So we'll talk about a group of cells in the brain called microglia and glial cells. It ultimately becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. So, for example, if people have brain injury when they're kids, like in their teens, let's say somebody gets in a car accident when they're 20 years old and they have a brain injury. 40 years later, they're more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease, right? The data on that's quite clear. So why would that be? You know, because a lot of times we're taught that Alzheimer's is like a genetic disease, it kind of runs in the family, something like that. Well, if that's true, then why would head injury increase the risk of mild head injury? Why would head injury increase the risk of Alzheimer's? We're going to go through this page at the end as well, so I don't have to cover everything right now. So we're going to talk about this picture quite a bit as we go through. Like this is the main take-home message of today. This one page, but we'll go through that kind of piece by piece. I published another short article on this topic last year related to fibromyalgia. It's available online for free if you have interest. So let's just look at some numbers related to migraine and fibromyalgia. Migraine affects approximately 13% of the international population. Fibromyalgia affects about 2% of the population. That's actually a lot of people, you know. So if you understand how to treat these conditions, I assume that most of you are in clinical practice, either as doctors or nutritionists. So this is a lot of people. I mean, you could basically run your practice only seeing these conditions. And we also see some associations with other conditions, not only fibromyalgia and migraine, but also chronic fatigue syndrome, irritable bowel syndrome, multiple chemical sensitivity, and interstitial cystitis, which is another variant of irritable bowel syndrome. All right, so this is a great diagram here. So let's talk about central sensitization, right? So the drug companies want you to believe that chronic pain is a result of central sensitization. Okay? That's what gets published in the research. That's what gets published in the review articles, that chronic pain is a result of central sensitization. And in my opinion, that is correct. I agree with it. The difference is that they say that central sensitization has no cause, no known cause, and I completely disagree with that. So we're starting from the same idea that chronic pain is caused by central sensitization. And chronic pain in this context means fibromyalgia, migraine headaches, the pain of lupus or rheumatoid arthritis, for example, psoriasis. So this covers a lot of different conditions. I think we all agree, we people who look at this stuff in the medical research, I think we all agree that these patients have central sensitization. The difference is, I think we should treat this with nutrition, and they think you should treat this with drugs. The difference is that my nutrition protocol works better than their drugs. So, first of all, no one can make sense of the term central sensitization, right? There's no inherent logic in that phrase other than it just means people have a brain that's sensitive to pain. But you can't do anything about it, right? There's no action. And